So, intents, chain abstraction, very popular, very, very hot topics over the past year and a half, year. Really excited to have you guys all here with us. Thanks for coming to do this. To kick things off, I think we can just go down the line, maybe do some intros. So, who are you? What do you do? How would you describe, chain abstraction in the context of what you're working on?
Hey guys, I'm Rishabh. I'm one of the founders of Socket. Socket is the first chain abstraction protocol. We basically leverage something called MOFA, Modular Order Flow Auctions, which is basically a marketplace between all the user requests coming in and these off-chain agents who execute them on-chain. In context of like chain abstraction and intents, I think like overall everything that we're really building is to abstract away all these like fragmentation complexities for the users, right? Like, so the basic principle, how we think about it is the fragmentation is not going anywhere as long as there are like 10 chains or 50 chains or 100 chains. The fragmentation is always going to exist, but the users don't really need to see it, right? Like, so you can just outsource all of that specialization, on-chain execution specialization to these off-chain agents, and achieve abstraction from in like a lot of ways from the users. And intent is basically one way that you can again do this, where like users don't need to even understand how or anything. They just kind of like describe, this is what I want, and they get it. So, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Tabasco. My real name is Ethan. I lead developer relations at Particle Network. Kind of TLDR, what we do is that we do something called account level chain abstraction, which means that essentially we provide users with accounts that they can use across any chain with a single balance. So if I have EthCC on Polygon and Arbitrum, I can actually use it on any chain, on any application, and I don't know as a user where my funds are necessarily. I don't need to know this, and I can just simply use these assets anywhere without needing to bridge. So this is quite important. This means that users can now access any application without really needing to like manually do the operations that they typically need to do to kind of manage multi-chain. So this is quite a big step for UX, and this is what we're building at Particle Network.
Hey guys, my name is Kendall. I work in the Near ecosystem, primarily on a product called Chain Signatures, which is basically enabling smart contracts and accounts on Near to sign transactions for any blockchain using a distributed MPC network. So the main use case and focus of us is actually more chain abstraction for developers, letting developers like build products that are actually pretty agnostic to where assets and chains that are flowing through their products are actually on or are used for. This can be used to create wallets that basically enable users to custody assets on any chain, maybe take any token for gas payments, and we have a couple teams working on that. It can also be used to create kind of truly multi-chain asset, chain agnostic, DEXs, lending protocols, et cetera, which is where intents come in, I think, the most, is more for those products.
Hey, my name is Richard. I'm the co-founder of Orb Labs, and we're sort of like solving chain abstraction from a node level. We're trying to create this sort of new kind of node that makes it possible for any wallet to become chain abstracted with very little sort of like changes to the underlying source code. So somewhere within that node, there's an intent protocol sort of like helping us orchestrate state across multiple different chains. And yeah, with that, you have chain abstraction available to everyday people using the exact same tools that are currently used today.
Hi, my name is Hao. I'm the CTO of Bento Batch and also from Blockto Wallet. So we were building a wallet since like 2019, and then later on we realized that it's hard to acquire users from wallet point of view because the onboarding barrier is too high for normal users. Then we decided to do furthermore. We built application interface for users to use to leverage AI technology for on-chain strategies. So basically we batch a bunch of transactions into one strategy. It's like the bottom-up approach of the intent and chain abstraction. So for other intent or chain abstraction infrastructures, they try to structure the whole like decentralized protocols for intent and solving. But for us, it's like from the real use cases, we build like, for example, delta neutral strategies or leverage staking strategy, etc. And we batch a bunch of transactions from like very bottom-up approach that we just build those transactions from scratch. But later on, we're looking at those intent and chain abstraction infrastructures to come in, and then we can like free our developers from building transactions from scratch. And instead of that, we can use those infrastructures to build like real user-friendly and like the user experience that makes sense for normal users instead of a lot of tech-savvy transactions building.
Awesome. So one question that gets asked a lot is, how, or one thing that's talked often about is how chain abstraction can improve user experience. But one thing I've been pretty curious about is how chain abstraction can also improve the developer experience. What different kinds of applications or what new ways can people design apps that can take advantage of these cross-chain protocols, and how can that kind of just improve UX, quote unquote. Just go down the line, or if anyone wants to just jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I think but yeah, I think overall, how the biggest benefit, like there are a lot of benefits from like a developer standpoint, right? I think like the easiest is, okay, the application now has great UX, right? But like I think like at a very fundamental level, like I think what they really get is like this ability to build wherever they want, right? Like so right now, like app chains and app rollups is like a very hot topic, like where does every application need like a chain or whatnot? I think like it does not matter if a developer really wants to experiment and like roll out their own chain, they should have like all the ability to do that. And with that, they should be the users should not really have to care about how to really like onboard to this chain or like any of these complexities, right? So I think like while there are like a lot of benefits, the biggest one that I would like kind of like point to is like just this ability to build wherever. Every app might have its own chain down the line, and yeah, like it'll be very fun to see.
So now we have build wherever in addition to Celestia's build whatever. So we're covering all of our bases here.
Yeah, 1,000 rollups. And
More. Infinite.
More rollups than users. That's the goal.
every user might have its own rollup.
Yeah, I agree. I think like typically there's like kind of two parts to this, and I'm sure Kendall will probably want to go deeper into this idea of like, there's this new type of application that's being created that's going to be enabled by chain abstraction that I'm particularly excited about, which is a chain agnostic application. So, and this could even tie into like app chain and stuff like that, but I'm specifically talking about applications that are going to be able to kind of compose and exist and interact across 5, 10, 15 blockchains simultaneously. Today, like applications are confined to one or a few blockchains, and this means that typically their set of interactions are limited to what's possible within this chain. So all of a sudden, with chain abstraction, especially with these kind of like more orchestration-focused solutions or things that really empower developers to seamlessly access multiple blockchains, these applications now actually exceed the confines of any single blockchain. So they exist and can use multiple chains within a single workflow and a single user experience. I think this is really important, and this is going to change the way that applications are built. It's going to add in a lot of new use cases to the ecosystem that just aren't possible with the current tooling today. And furthermore, I think that this has an implication for developers at the market level, because, and I talk about this a lot too, and I think this is quite important because essentially now that applications can access users from any chain, and applications are intrinsically agnostic, as are users with the kind of this advent of chain abstraction. All of a sudden, as an application, I'm not competing with those within one chain or one ecosystem. So, for example, if I have a DEX on BNB, right now I'm only competing with other applications or other DEXs on BNB. I'm not competing with a DEX on Linea, for example. But all of a sudden with chain abstraction, what happens is now the entire market, every application within the ecosystem is competing against one another, because users can access applications from anywhere, and applications can exist anywhere. So this means that the incentives to create good UX and secure experiences and things that really attract users and have a true product market fit, these incentives are much greater, because today what we see as an issue is a lot of like replication of the same applications or the same use cases across multiple different chains, because that's easy and it makes easy revenue. But with this competition, this increased level of just like there's no hiding behind one ecosystem. It's like it's a free for all at this point. It's a true free market. This means that I think that the ecosystem will start to evolve towards a far more user centric and actual like we'll see like actually interesting use cases and applications, because this is where the money is at now. So I think that this is going to be most interesting and one of the less talked about effects of chain abstraction.
Yeah, I really like that point, and I think the idea of seeing like the Uniswap for Ethereum or like the Aave for Solana like going away is really exciting, and DeFi just not becoming like X-chain DeFi, but just DeFi. And then I'll give this example that I think Ethan unfortunately has had to hear me give like 3 times now. But one of the cool types of applications you can build that's basically composing multiple products on different blockchains into one united experience that we've been talking a lot about is the idea of like a decentralized Athena, right? So Athena basically takes like a collateral asset, say like ETH, and then right now like is used on like a centralized exchange to basically take a 1x short position against the same asset so that you create this delta neutral position. If you wanted to do that in a decentralized way, one of the big challenges you have is that the assets you want to use, ETH or Bitcoin, are on different chains. The venues you want to use that have the most liquidity for perps are Hyperliquid and DYDX, both on different chains. And then somewhere in between, you're actually going to have, like in a decentralized way, you're going to have to borrow against that ETH or Bitcoin position, borrow USDC, because that's what's used as a collateral asset for those perps exchanges. So these are 3 different, probably at least 2 or 3 different chains that you have to compose in order to create this product. And with a lot of the chain abstraction products, including chain signatures, I think Anoma's Orchestrator and others, you can actually now build this kind of like multi-blockchain higher order product that just hasn't been possible until like just about now. So excited to see how people can use that and like open up this entirely new design space.
Yeah, I think the application type I'm more excited to see in this space is the sort of like further increase in rise of single chain apps. So applications that just sort of build one chain and forget about everything else. I think for the last 2, 3, 4 years, it's always been the case of if you're a developer, you have a great application that's scaling, you're now being forced to deploy your application on multiple different chains just to get users. And I think in a world where at least we achieve user-facing chain abstraction through the account level, that won't be necessary anymore. You can just sort of deploy on one chain and just sit back and watch people come to you from anywhere. Obviously, there are a few caveats, the main ones being like the assets you can support on that particular sort of like application. But I think the single chain apps sort of like being allowed to just exist as they are sort of like the main future I'm sort of looking forward to.
I think I'll go from the other side. So from developer point of view, before you know the technology you're using, but after abstraction, the intent stuff, I kind of abstracted those things away. And it's somewhat good, but somewhat bad. Because if you look at those underlying technologies or networks, actually you don't know what network you're using. Even users, what your users are using, you don't know. So we all know that the security level is actually based on the least secure component of your system. So for example, there's a network got attacked, and then you somehow use chain abstraction and utilize the liquidity or the functionality of that network, so you probably got attacked as well. And I think that's the hard thing for developers to do system design in terms of in the rising era of the chain abstraction. So for us, we're looking at those like cross-chain bridge, and then looking at those cross-chain protocols if we want to send transaction across the networks. And then it's already pretty hard for us to assess that which bridge is more secure, which bridge is with better user experience, and then we want balance between those. And after chain abstraction or intent stuff comes in, it would be even harder for us to decide. So I think it's like, it's better for user experience for sure, but it's a bit hard for developers in the future to decide which one is better and which one is more secure, and which one do we want to provide, what kind of level of UX and what kind of level of security to our users.
Nice. Kendall, you brought up Athena, which there's like certainly some controversy around it, as I think like many like CDPs, stablecoins tend to have. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on, your thoughts on like how, basically just a little bit more on what you were saying.
Sure. Yeah, the concept is basically the ability to, especially, let's imagine we have this increasingly app chain world, right? I don't know if that's how it's going to go, but certainly there's some trend in that direction. I think at the very least we've seen that the 2 most popular perpetual swap dexes are their own chain. Hyperliquid feels a bit like Arbitrum, but like they are their own chain, and that's going to, I think, become increasingly apparent. So if you wanted to compose products with those chains, like either you need those chains themselves have to become platforms, and like I think there's a possibility that happens. But then you run into the challenge of like, well, those chains aren't going to have a lot of the high quality assets that users want to interact with, particularly Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so that creates a problem if you want to create any sort of higher level structured product combining a few of those different components. So I think that's like one way you can go. So I give Athena as the example just because if you want, the reason we haven't seen, we've seen some attempts to decentralize Athena. The reason that it didn't take off and that Athena did is that Athena said, well, we'll just be centralized. That way we can work with the incredibly liquid perpetual swap dexes, Binance, OKEx, all the big ones. And then we can actually like scale this product. That's created a lot of controversy too for kind of that reason. And the fact that I think there is some regulatory risk there for them, but we'll see how that goes. They probably look all like Tether, so they might be okay. But if you're a purist and you want to actually do this in a fully decentralized way, then you actually do need a new type of product that will enable you to compose these different blockchains, and you need to do that in a structured way. So you need some type of system that can basically like. It kind of came up in that intense discussion earlier, right? There's a bunch of state changes on different chains that have to happen in a specific order. Repeatedly in order to create this product, and so you need some way to like actually enable that to happen, which is something that a few of the different chain abstraction groups are focused on.
For sure. And to change gears a little bit, there was one thing that I wanted to ask you guys about, which is, all of you are working on like varying degrees of chain abstraction, and for like us at Essential, like we're very focused on not specifically chain abstraction, but just building like very cohesive, very comprehensive, like generalized intent infrastructure. And so for us, like solvers are a very key part of that. Like without solvers, without like a strong decentralized set of solvers, like Essential couldn't really function. I shouldn't say that. Like it could still work. We're gonna have our own solvers too. But are solvers something that you guys are all thinking about as well in terms of like how users are submitting these cross-chain actions? Like what would the role of a solver be for you guys, if any?
Yeah, I think how I think about it in general is like, again, right, like there are like so many chains, right, and they will always exist, and all of these complexities that we see today, they will always exist, right? But again, the user doesn't have to see that, right? So the user can kind of like interact with like this global block space paradigm in some sense, right? Like, so all of their interactions can be like chain abstracted or in this like global nature. But at the end of the day, all of that has to translate into like these on-chain actions, right? It's really hard for users to directly interact with like this on-chain complexity. So solvers basically are more like participants that kind of like come in for this to happen, right? So solvers are responsible for taking actions, at least with Socket, like they're responsible for taking actions or like transacting on-chain on behalf of the users, but while ensuring that you can control the actions of the solvers in whatever shape and form, right? So every user, while they interact in this global paradigm, will have some things that are really truly important to them, right? So for example, for a user, it might be speed, for another one, it might be cost, for another one, it might be security, or a combination of these, right? They should have this ability to control the behaviors of this solver, or kind of like put in some constraints, on the solvers, and as long as they can do that, this whole paradigm can basically function for the users, and they get all of these amazing benefits.
I guess first of all, I think solvers and sort of even like intent-based architectures are pretty foundational to a lot of chain abstraction solutions. But I also think that like kind of starting a little bit off topic here, but I think that there's also some degree of misconception sometimes that like solvers and intent-based systems are required for chain abstraction. I think there's plenty of solutions that achieve chain abstraction or contribute to it significantly that don't use a system. But for us specifically at Particle, we do use like a solver-like system, but we do it in a way that's like a pretty low-level primitive. So we usually use the word like filler more often, where essentially like the way that we actually move funds across chain is pretty simple. We kind of have fillers front these funds, and then we pay them back with this transaction, and we kind of use an intermediary token like EthCC to move funds across chains. It's sort of a cross-like in a sense. And for us, the reason why we do this is because it's much more efficient and much cheaper than using like a traditional bridge. Of course, there's risk attached to this, like reorg risk, but this is why you have things like one balance. But yeah, so anyways, this is like at Particle, we definitely implement this because we believe, at least within our architecture, like we need some way to move funds across chains, and this is the most efficient way to do it. Much better than using like any sort of canonical bridging. So this is like, I think they play a pretty significant role in chain abstraction in many cases. But the point that I want to make is that it's not necessarily like you don't, as an architecture, you don't need to use solvers to enable chain abstraction or contribute to chain abstraction. Albeit, like even at Particle, we've seen that this is often one of the most efficient ways to do things, at least in the context of things like account level chain abstraction. But there are other ways to do things as well, and I think that these are also quite important to cover typically.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's definitely plenty of applications of chain abstraction, especially when it's like abstracting the chain away entirely, or at least in part, where you don't necessarily need solvers. But especially when I think solvers are the right way to do cross-chain. I think like keeping assets where they are, not using wrapping, unwrapping patterns, at least as much as you can get away with not doing that, you should. I think what is kind of interesting is like even within our ecosystem, we have like 4 or 5 teams building solvers. Already, like different solvers. Like they're trying to solve similar problems, which is basically like have your assets on one chain, trading that for assets on another chain with a counterparty, but they're implementing in a different way. And I think we're kind of seeing this across the space. There's how many different solver implementations now, which is it's gonna be interesting to see if we can like rectify that and kind of like create some standardization or unification or like generalized kind of solve. I know teams are working on this, like kind of like solver groups or liquidity pools, which is great. I think it'll be beneficial if we can get to that point. But yeah, I think the breakdown of like if you're moving assets between chain solvers is really valuable. If you're not, there's still plenty of reasons like that they can be beneficial, but they're not as necessary depending on the use case.
Yeah, I think as far as chain abstraction is concerned, as a sort of like scope of chains we're sort of dealing with become larger, it becomes almost impossible to do a chain abstraction without solvers. So we're going to see like the whole solver landscape evolve very quickly. I think the part of the solver landscape I'm most excited about is this idea of partial solvers, having solvers that don't do everything. So I think generally speaking right now, when most people talk about the whole solving landscape, it's very much so centered around this idea of this one singular entity making sure things happen. But again, as the sort of landscape becomes more complicated, we're going to see a world where it becomes a cluster of solvers that orchestrate and work together to achieve various sort of like end goals. And yeah, I'm pretty excited about that. I think that's going to become the sort of like perhaps the golden sort of like solution for chain abstraction down the line.
Solver to me is more like a dark forest right now. It's like it like reminds me a lot of the researchers. Like it's like the most basic solvers already exist. And then it comes up with me, and then it reminds me about like the risk of users. And I think solvers would be very profit-driven parties around this ecosystem. So for the protocols, for the intent protocols building, we have to make sure that it's a fair protocol for the greater good, not for like profit-driven stuff, and then we'll end up with another dark forest on intent memory pool. So yeah, solvers like for now it still looks very, very dangerous to me. But I think because we've got like Flashbot, we got those MEV protected network right now working. So those experiences might be taken and then into those infrastructures, and then we can build a better protocols that ensure we do, for example, we do back running instead of front running, and we do like more user, like benefit the user instead of benefit the solvers.
Yeah, I really agree with you on that. And I think solvers are not only a dark forest in terms of like the technical side of things, but also the legal side of things. Because ultimately you have a entity, whether it be a person or a program, that is acting in some capacity as a money transmitter, supposedly. And with that comes the requirements for a lot of licensing, like depending on where it's operating, like where, if it's running out of a cloud somewhere, or if you have like a bare metal rack, like in your closet running a solver, it could be subject to various laws that have to do with transmission of money. And then, if you solve a transaction for someone, and that transaction possibly was like touched by Lazarus or some other group that maybe was involved with like a sanctioned protocol or a sanctioned smart contract or something like that, then who is potentially liable? So it's funny because we're getting to this stage, I think, in blockchain where we're finally starting to clear the air on the legality around like what is a security, what is not a security. Things are really starting to move forward in like the blockchain kind of like getting it more of its foot in the door in the TradFi world, and now we're moving into this like whole new world of chain abstraction and intents, where we're seeing like, okay, now we're going to have a whole new set of legal challenges to deal with, and what are we going to do about those, which is really exciting, I think. I can't wait to see like the first solver that just gets an FBI raid in their house or something like that.
I am curious though, would you consider a solver to be a money transmitter in a world where they don't have control over the funds, but some other protocol does?
As in like the solver is not acting as a custodian, like they're simply providing like, hey, here is a way you could do this.
Yep.
And I mean, like probably not. Like if the solver doesn't touch the funds, then they're not necessarily complicit, because like if I ask someone how, let's get weird for a second. Like if I asked someone like how to make meth and they told me how to make meth and then I made meth, is that person responsible for me making meth?
Not in my books.
Same here. Like I don't think they would be, but I mean, the courts may not see it that way, but who knows?
Do you really need solvers though if they're not going to be? I mean, I feel like solvers obviously, you guys especially are kind of like pushing the boundary on like what solver actually means, and maybe there are cases where like they are just kind of finding a route for you. But I think most of what solver means today is like assets and basically fronting assets and then taking on the execution risk themselves of like getting the best price and making it profitable. And like what they charge you would be based on how good of a price they think they can get.
I would argue though that became a thing more so because Lacrosse sort of like doubled down and made intents very much so tethered to like interrupt, right? Because like initial solvers are basically just finding routes.
But that could be like, the best solver is probably going to be like maybe not an LLM, but some model that's just like has a really good map, and everyone can just run that themselves or like hit up some API. Like you don't necessarily need this like decentralized solver network.
That's
if it's
fair too. And in that world, then I guess the sort of like landscape will evolve. The only solvers that become important are the liquidity provisioning ones. I can see that. I'm sort of like not disputing on that front at all. I definitely see a world where the liquidity provisioning solvers become like the biggest kind of solvers, and then the route finder solvers basically sort of like evolve over time and sort of like go from there.
Well, I guess is it on? Oh yeah. All right. So I guess that's the thing that differentiates the industry from the traditional world. So it's like if you're asking, do you need another settlement layer instead of Ethereum? Then we don't need, but it creates a marketplace, and with the marketplace, you got the free competition, and then you got a competition, and you got those economically incentivized entities to provide like good behaviors for users, and then for the protocol itself, it provides a good incentive instead of what I just mentioned, the dark forest, for them to just grab the money from users. So for the industry to move forward, we need those like good protocols. By good as in we incentivize the long-term good instead of the short-term economic profits. And then with that in mind, we are kind of not really redoing like the traditional work, but we are reinventing those protocols, reinventing those incentives for those entities to perform instead of the traditional banks or traditional wire transfer kind of stuff.
Do you think there's a world where theoretically like TradFi sees acting as a solver in like on chain as like their foot in the door?
So TradFi is like TransferWise a solver, right? TransferWise
Right.
Solves like the cross-border transfer for you, but at the end it charges, and you don't know what it charges, and you don't know like what happens under the hood. And for the intent or for the blockchain itself, try to solve is that make this thing all like economically incentivized and free market for everybody and permissionless. That's the thing about. That's the blockchain. All the blockchain about. So if you look at TradFi, of course everybody's solving things. It's like I don't know, like commodity, security, and money. It's like everybody's solving, but they solve under the hood. They solve in the black box. You don't know what happens.
I guess are you saying you're looking at a world where J.P. Morgan's first foray into like crypto is basically being a solver for an intent protocol?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. Is like, yeah,
I can
is
see
that
that.
like that because a solver is right now like a very legitimate business model. to run. So, with the current, TradFi world, they've been looking at ways that they can actually like get into this space and profit off of it without necessarily like launching a blockchain that they have to then assume the risk for. And if they're already acting as a solver for like cross-border payments, transfers, and stuff like that, as House said, then like theoretically this could be a way for them to jump in.
Blockchains are the new borders, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like market makers are absolutely solvers, and there's most of the major market makers have like some kind of crypto activity, either as an experiment or like pretty seriously. So I think that's like the brain dead solver version, but like clearly that's like there's demand and they're already doing this. And I think probably 1inch was like the first group to really get. I mean, 1inch is solvers on top of basically liquidity pools, but especially for the major assets, like really those guys are mostly just arbing against Binance and like taking a spread. So I think, yeah, it's kind of already happening, and I fully expect that. I think you're right. Like, for most financial institutions, that's probably the cleanest path. Well, maybe, I don't know. With Jump having some some interesting cases coming up, we'll see if that's going to like cool that market at all for some of the more traditional folks. But I think there's probably some flavor of solving that maybe is more palatable and like sort of clean and regulatorily white for these groups.
Yeah, they're like always like in the finance world. Actually, they're like all these layers that already exist that do a lot of similar stuff, right? I mean, like technically speaking, like all of these market makers that participate in like sexes like Binance or Coinbase, they're also like web, like TradFi solvers, right? So they can easily come in and kind of like participate in dexes and intent solving and everything, right? Like, so I think like the foray of everyone will be like through swaps, because that's like the most easiest way, and then like it might go to lending and borrowing and all of these assets as well, or all of these use cases as well.
We are unfortunately at time. I just want to thank you guys all for coming out and being on this panel. It's been fantastic speaking with all of you. And this also concludes Declarative Day. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for modding.